Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now, Jefferson Morley. He's the author of CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. He is also the author of Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master James Jesus Angleton. Mr. Morley, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Pedro.
Could you talk about your work as someone who researches the events of JFK's murder?
My background is writing books about the CIA, and I've written 3 biographies of major officials in the CIA in the 1960s. Win Scott was the chief of the Mexico City station in the 1960s. My book, Our Man in Mexico, is a biography of him. James Angleton was the chief of counterintelligence at the CIA from 1954 to 1974. And my book, The Ghost, is a biography of him. And I have a forthcoming book, Scorpion's Dance, which is the story of Richard Nixon and Richard Helms, the 8th director of the CIA. So Win Scott, Jim Angleton, and Richard Helms were all major CIA officials from the 1950s to the 1970s. They were all friends. They were all intimately involved in the events of 1963. So I don't write about the Kennedy assassination per se. I write about the Kennedy assassination in the context of the CIA.
What's important to understand, for our viewers to understand your perspective then of that position that you take?
Because I don't write about conspiracy theories. I write about what the events of November 1963 looked like to CIA insiders. This is the story that we now know, not a story that could be known in 1963. But how did these men see what happened in Dallas, what happened to the president, what happened with the investigation, and how did they respond? And what we see in all 3 stories is the idea that one man alone came along and killed the president for no reason. None of these men acted like that was the case. Rather, they acted like Lee Harvey Oswald was a very sensitive matter whose knowledge, whose actions, and whose knowledge by the CIA had to be held very closely. And what we saw this week is a process that is still unfolding. The CIA is still holding very closely certain information about Kennedy's assassination. So my books are designed to open up this and say, what did the Kennedy assassination look like to the CIA itself?
When it comes then to that information that you talk about, there was a release of documents recently by the National Archives. Talk about that release and also put it into perspective what's totally held by the archives concerning the JFK assassination.
Okay, so last week, 1,491 documents that contained redactions, omitted material, were released in full for the first time. 14,000 documents related to Kennedy's assassination continue to have redactions in them. So we only got less than 10% of the outstanding documents last week. Also, it's important to understand when you think about that release, why are we releasing records? Well, in 1992, Congress passed a law, the JFK Records Act. At that point, Oliver Stone had just made his movie and had scored points in public opinion by pointing out the very true fact that 30 years after the assassination, almost all of the government's records on the subject were classified information. Stone put a little trailer at the end of his movie and he said, you know, if you object to this, write your congressman. Capitol Hill was inundated with mail saying, why doesn't the government release this information? And Congress was shamed into doing the right thing. And they passed a pretty good law. The JFK Records Act said, we are going to release all JFK records. We're going to clear the record. We're going to make this transparent to everybody. We want all JFK records to be public. And they created a process to do that. They created something called the Assassination Records Review Board. This was an independent board made up of civilian experts, and they went to each government agency and said, show us your JFK records. We will review them for classified information, and then we will make them public. And in the 1990s, that's what they did. And they declassified more than 300,000 records related to Kennedy's assassination, 5 million pages. So this was a big step forward in terms of completing the historical record of Kennedy's assassination. Right?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but the law gave the agencies, primarily the CIA and FBI, but government agencies, the right to withhold certain information for a certain amount of time. But what Congress said was after 25 years, everything has to be made public. So the law was passed in 1992. 25 years later, October 2017, the question came to President Trump. And the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, went to Trump and said, we cannot release this information. We have to keep it secret.
Now, if I may interrupt, and I apologize, some of those concerns cited because of national security. What do you think about that as an argument?
I mean, if you look at the records and you see what is withheld on national security grounds, you will laugh. It will be things like, we had an intelligence relationship with the British government. That was one of the things that was released this week. In a document, we had intelligence relations and it was blanked out, and when they took it off, it said British. Now, is it a national security secret that the U.S. has intelligence relations with Britain? That's preposterous. But that's the kind of thing that's going on, is wild overclassification. National security is given as the justification, but when you look at what is actually withheld, it's very, very rarely something that rises to the level of national security. In these documents, there are some names of informants. That's the kind of material that was previously withheld. But we're talking about events that happened 50 or 60 years ago, right? It was 58 years ago that President Kennedy was assassinated. So the national security value of the information that was held, in most cases, it's minimal or non-existent.
Let me take a second to invite our callers into the conversation. If you want to ask our guests questions about this topic, here's how you can call us: 202-748-8000 for those of you in the Eastern and Central time zones, and it's 202-748-8001 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can text us at 202-748-8003. Post comments on Facebook and Twitter as well. You go back to that deadline, October 26, 2017. It goes to the Trump administration. It gets extended. Why?
Trump said that this material had to be withheld for another 4 years. He gave the CIA, the FBI, and other federal agencies another 4 years of secrecy. So that kicked the question to President Biden in October 2021. And again, the CIA and the FBI failed to meet the deadline. President Biden announced on October 22nd that the agencies could continue to withhold material, but they had to deliver something by December 15th. So last week, we got 10% of the 15,000 documents that still have redactions, leaving 14,000 documents which are supposed to be released a year from now, but frankly, I don't believe it. I mean, they've blown the deadline twice, and then on the third time around, they give us 10% of what the law requires. So clearly, the CIA doesn't want to obey this law. I mean, they keep evading the requirements of the law. They've done it 3 times now. So I'm not sure that we're ever going to see these records. But according to the law, they're supposed to be released a year from now. So that's kind of the big picture, right? They've blown the deadline twice. They've doled out the minimal. And these records most of these records have been seen before. Not a lot of surprises in here. There's probably only, out of those 1,491 documents, most of which are from the CIA, about 900 are from the CIA. We've seen these documents before for the most part. Only a couple of them seem to be entirely new, a couple of FBI documents. But the important thing is to step back and look at kind of the big picture, right? Which is, what have we learned since all these documents began to come into the record? Since the 1990s, what have we learned? Now, some people say, well, there's no smoking gun, and try to end the conversation there. You know, that's kind of not really that's avoiding what these records tell us. What we've learned since the 1990s is the official story that one man came along and killed the president, and another guy came along and killed that man, and there was nothing to it, there was no politics involved. That explanation, never particularly credible, has gotten less credible over time. And a couple of things that we've learned since the mid-1990s from the new records, really stand out. One, the story that this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, kind of came out of nowhere and we didn't know anything about him, that's nonsense. The CIA knew all about Lee Harvey Oswald. They had been following him for 4 years. They'd monitored all of his actions. Every piece of paper in the federal government, from the FBI, the State Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Marine Corps, which Oswald was in. All of the information about Oswald went to one place in the CIA, the counterintelligence staff, run by James Angleton. And I talk about this in my book, The Ghost. So the idea that this guy came out of nowhere and shot the president, that's the official story. It's simply not true. I mean, let's say Oswald shot the president. I'm not sure he did, but let's say he did. The fact remains that we now know top CIA officials, very senior undercover operations officers, were fully informed about Lee Harvey Oswald's movements, his personal life, his political beliefs, and even his contacts with presumed foreign intelligence agents were known to top CIA officers 6 weeks before Kennedy was killed. And then, when Kennedy was killed and Oswald was arrested for the crime, the CIA pretended that they didn't know anything about him. And that pretense, we didn't really know anything about this guy, we now know that that was a lie, and it was a lie from the start. And that lying has continued to this day. So really what we learned from the release last week is they're still holding back the whole story.
We have calls lined up for you.
Okay.
Let's start with Ralph in New York for our guest, Jefferson Morley. Ralph, good morning. Thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I got 3 questions for your guest. I'll be brief.
Sure, Ralph.
What he thinks of them. The first one, why did we never got a satisfactory answer for why did Oswald wait until Kennedy got on Elm Street, where he had a clear shot on Houston Street for no other reason for an ambush? The second question is, Jacqueline Kennedy, if you look at the Zapruder film very closely, her head is right in front of the president's head. So it seems like if he was shot from behind, she would have been assassinated. And the third question is, if you watch it closely, the Zapruder film, his left shoulder is bounced right off the back seat cushion, so he's really floored. And I thank you.
Yeah, the caller makes a good question. You know, if Oswald was in the 6th floor window, he had a much easier shot as the motorcade approached as opposed to when it was going away. And what we see is in the eyewitness testimony of the people who were at the scene of the crime, you know, a lot of people thought that there was gunfire from 2 different directions. So the caller's right. It's a mystery. If that's the explanation, that Oswald was acting alone, why didn't he shoot earlier? A very good question. Jackie Kennedy's position during the assassination, she's the closest eyewitness to what happened, right? Now, Jackie Kennedy never believed the official story that one man alone killed her president. She did not believe that. She believed that the president was killed by his domestic enemies. And she and Bobby Kennedy conveyed that message. We now know, this is one of the things we've learned since the 1990s. Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy told a friend who was going to the Soviet Union in 1963 after the president was killed, and they gave him a message. And they said, here's a message for the leaders of the Soviet Union. There's talk about Oswald was a communist. We don't put any stock in that. We believe that the president was killed by his domestic enemies. And Bobby Kennedy said, I'm going to run for president, and if I regain the presidency, I'm going to continue my brother's policies towards the Soviet Union. So Jackie and Bobby send a very friendly message to the Soviet government, saying we don't buy this business about Oswald being a communist or the president was killed by a communist. We believe he was killed by domestic enemies. That was a very strong belief that they held. Bobby Kennedy held that belief for the rest of his life.
In Georgia, this is Michael. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. I was 5 years old when all this happened, and it was my 9/11 up until my adulthood. And the haste with which he was assassinated and buried, 3 days, I mean, that was telling me something. But everything from the National Security Memorandum 263 all the way up to, my question is, if you think that the CIA was privy to what Oswald was doing, do you think other upper echelon people in the government might have known also? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Thank you, caller. I was 5 years old also when it happened, so we come to this with the exact same experience. I remember sitting around a black and white TV. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something big had happened, and that was all. It's a very good question. You know, what did people in the upper echelons of the CIA know about Oswald. As I said before, there was a group of top officials, the chief of operations in the Western Hemisphere, the chief of operations in Mexico City, the assistant to counterintelligence chief James Angleton, the assistant to deputy director Richard Helms. All of these people were informed about Oswald's movements, 6 weeks before the assassination. So what did they know? What did they make of Oswald? This is part of why people still want the rest of the story, because we really don't have a good explanation. The CIA's never explained, and I hope that, people will go to the CIA and ask them, now that we have most of the records, not all of the records, but 95% of them, does the CIA have an explanation for why so many top officials knew about the man who supposedly killed the president and didn't do anything? What's the explanation for that? We don't have a good explanation. That's why people are still interested in these records.
Congress took this on under the Warren Commission. What did you think of those conclusions?
The Warren Commission was operating, at the mercy of the CIA, basically. And so I think that the Warren Commission did not have access to all the information. I think they were misled by the CIA. I know. On the day of the assassination, after Oswald was arrested, people went to the CIA and said, do you have anything on this guy who's been arrested for killing the president? This former Marine who had lived in the Soviet Union and come back? And the CIA said, we have a handful of documents. We have 5 records about him, a newspaper clipping from when he defected and a few other things. That was the story. On November 22nd, 1963, the CIA said, we have 5 records about him. That was a lie. The Warren Commission found out, almost by accident, that the CIA had other records, and they went back and asked the CIA for them. So 10 weeks later, 10 weeks, the CIA admitted, no, we didn't have 5 documents on him. We had 42 documents on him. 42 documents collected over the course of 4 years. The CIA Deputy Director Richard Helms told the Warren Commission under oath the information they had about Oswald was minimal, quote unquote, minimal. Okay? In fact, they knew his politics, his personal life. They were reading his mail. That's how closely Oswald was watched. They were reading his mail. Everywhere he went, the CIA was updated about his where he was living, what he was doing. So the CIA was very well informed, and they basically watched Oswald come back from the Soviet Union, come to Texas, go to New Orleans, where he lived for a little while. He went to Mexico City. The CIA knew about that. He came back from Mexico City. He was living in Texas. The CIA was informed that Lee Harvey Oswald was in Texas on November 15th, 1963. That's how much they knew about him. And after the president was killed and Oswald was arrested and then killed, the CIA played dumb and said, we don't know anything about this guy. That was a lie. And so basically what we found out last week is they're still lying. One important thing did happen last week, and I want to emphasize this. I get calls on, 1,491 JFK documents came out. Is there a smoking gun in there? Well, you can't do historical research on a newspaper deadline, on an internet deadline. It just doesn't work. You've got to spend time with it. But one thing jumps out at me in going through the records, and I haven't gone through all of them yet, but I'm getting there. One thing that is very important to understand is I believe that now the CIA's pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, all the information that they collected on him from 1959 to November 21st, 1963, those 42 documents have now been declassified in full for the first time. Okay? Think about that. It's been 58 years, and only last week did we have a completely unredacted copy of all of those records. So what does that mean? Why did it take 58 years to declassify the CIA's file on Lee Harvey Oswald? That's a very good question, and that's one that JFK researchers are going to begin to try and answer now. We don't have an explanation from the CIA. They're still playing dumb, and they're still withholding records. So we face this problem of a recalcitrant CIA that doesn't want to obey the law and has not provided all the records, but we are beginning to get to the complete historical record of Kennedy's assassination, and that's an important step. A second thing that...
Can I read a call just real quick? So Moses in Lake Elmo, Minnesota, go ahead.
Yes, good morning, C-SPAN. Good morning, America. I really appreciate your journalistic work here. Have you seen the Oliver Stone JFK Revisited? Great program.
I was interviewed in it. Yes, I have seen it. It's very good.
It is very good. And I must say that my take on this whole thing is when people start talking about no one's above the law, you better believe there is. And Eisenhower warned us of it, and JFK got right in the crosshairs of it. When he didn't give them air support down in Cuba on that stupid CIA operation, they were not happy. He was going to cut the CIA's budget by 20 to 30%. He wanted to shatter it into 1,000 pieces because they were too powerful. They were acting outside the law, and they're still doing that today. Arlen Specter was the one working on that commission for him. I can't believe they put Dulles on there. I mean, can you believe it? The guy who gets fired ends up being on the commission. That guy was one of the weirdest dudes I've ever seen. And if you watch that movie, you'll see how just creepy he is.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is the CIA took out our president, and nobody's been accountable for it. And that shot came from the front. The people went running after that shot that came from the front.
Yeah,
because they wanted to chase down this guy.
We'll let our guest answer. We'll let our guest answer that, caller. Thank you.
Yeah, a month after Kennedy's assassination, former President Harry Truman, the 33rd president, wrote an editorial in the Washington Post in which he called for the abolition of the CIA. Now, Truman did not talk about JFK's assassination in that column, and he never publicly linked his opinion to Kennedy's assassination. But there's no doubt that Truman's call for the abolition of the CIA was a direct response to the assassination of Kennedy. Harry Truman knew more about the CIA than anybody. He was the one who signed it into existence in 1947. Let me say, reluctantly. Initially, Harry Truman was against the creation of a Central Intelligence Agency, a peacetime intelligence agency. He said in 1945, "We don't want an American Gestapo," because a peacetime and secret intelligence agency he viewed as a threat to the democratic process. 2 years later, the Cold War is heating up. Truman wants a source of information, and he agrees, he relents and allows the creation of the CIA, and he signs it into existence. When he's signing the CIA into existence, he's saying, we have to make sure that we don't have an American Gestapo. He still had that same concern about a secret police. 14 years later, Kennedy was killed. Truman had had enough, and he said, let's abolish the CIA. So the concern about the CIA and the Kennedy's assassination started immediately, and it started at the top of the U.S. government. It started with Harry Truman. So that, and then 58 years later, we see an agency that is refusing to comply with the law, a law passed unanimously by Congress. They've blown 2 deadlines. Now they've blown 3 deadlines. People they simply don't believe the CIA on this question. This is why the CIA has to make these documents public. They have no credibility on JFK's assassination.
Just so you were talking earlier about the statement from this White House concerning the release, they put out a statement on October of this year, October 22nd, saying temporary continued postponement is necessary to protect against identifiable harm to the military defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or the conduct of foreign relations that is such gravity that it outweighs the public interest in immediate discourse. Similar to what you heard from the last administration on this.
Yes, and when you go and look at these documents and you look at what's redacted, identifiable harm to the national defense, nothing that was released last week would have harmed the national defense if it had been released 4 years ago. I guarantee you that. Nothing that rose to that level of seriousness. There may still be things that are being withheld. I believe that there may be some true national security information in these records, but it's a very tiny percentage. It's not 14,000 documents which continue to have redactions.
Our guest, Jefferson Morley, who was talking about the new JFK assassination documents released. This is Mike in West Springfield, Massachusetts. Good morning.
Good morning. This very important subject for me. I was alive during the day of Kennedy. I have a question, and my question is, When Batista ran Cuba before Fidel Castro came into power, the gambling industry was on the roll of a lifetime.
Yes.
Kennedy's failure to rid Cuba of Fidel Castro after he came to power cost the gambling industry a fortune because they were literally run out of Cuba.
Yeah.
My question is, going past the CIA, I was wondering, is there the possibility that those in charge of the gambling industry, knowing they were all too pleased when Kennedy disappeared from the scene, did they have a role in putting Kennedy away? I'd like to know if you could comment on that. It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And,
Okay. Thank you, caller. We'll let him answer.
The caller's exactly right. The gambling industry was very big in Havana in the late 1950s. They were building hotels. They had extremely favorable income tax provisions. They had a free hand, basically, and they were making lots of money. And when Castro took power and, had a left-wing government, they were driven out and they lost lots of money. And they were very bitter about that. And they wanted to regain, their standing. I think that in recent years, I haven't seen evidence that suggests that organized crime were the intellectual authors of the assassination. I do think that the fact that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby was a man who aspired to be an organized crime figure, had friends in organized crime. I think that the assassination of Oswald is a sign of organized crime involvement in the events of 1963. I don't think that organized crime organized the assassination of the president.
Let's hear from Mary Lou in Connecticut. Good morning. You're next.
Good morning. Yes, that is true what you just said. Fidel Castro was behind the killing of Bobby and Jack Kennedy because Jack and Bobby Kennedy were going to kill Fidel Castro. And he said, oh, no, they're not going to kill me. I'm going to kill them. And they were connected to the Chicago Mafia through their father in the Prohibition era. And so when they said that that Jack Ruby was from Fidel Castro, Fidel Castro arranged Sirhan and Oswald, because neither one of them are smart enough to ever pull off something like that. This was behind. Fidel Castro is absolutely responsible for the killing.
If I can say something, there is absolutely no evidence of that. There is no evidence that Fidel Castro was involved in Kennedy's assassination. It's simply not true. And let's keep our eye on the news and what's going on now. Fidel Castro is not withholding 14,000 documents from the U.S. public, right? He's dead. Fidel Castro didn't have anything to do with Kennedy's assassination. Fidel Castro said on the day after the assassination, this is very bad news. Kennedy was a man who was beginning to make moves towards peace with Cuba. Castro was very disappointed and upset about Kennedy's killing because it made life much more difficult for him. He had seen hope for reconciliation with the United States under Kennedy, perhaps in his second term. And this is why Kennedy's enemies hated him, because he did not invade Cuba. Not during the Bay of Pigs, not during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the idea that Fidel Castro was behind the assassination, that was a notion that CIA assets put out right away after the assassination, but there's no factual basis to it.
Why do you think after all these years, the assassination still holds fascination with people, especially as you hear people tell you various things about what they think happened?
Because the government's never provided a credible explanation, because the CIA has been lying about it for 58 years. Like I said before, on day one, they told the first lie about the assassination, and those lies have continued ever since. And so when people get a lot of lies and they're asked to believe a story that's not credible, then they come up with, people are searching for an answer. And the reason the Kennedy assassination story endures is because we don't have a good explanation of what happened. And we have a secret intelligence agency that continues to withhold documents of the murder of a president 58 years later in defiance of a law. I mean, what else are people going to think? But they must be hiding something serious. You know, why otherwise, why wouldn't they come clean? I mean, think about it. If it's so cut and dried, this guy up and shot the president, you know, case closed. It's very simple. If it was very simple, why did it take 58 years to declassify the Oswald file? You know, that's the thing that the CIA can't explain. And so the CIA has this big JFK problem. It's like, you know, they don't have a credible story to tell, and they have a lot to hide. That's the reality that we're facing right now.
Who's responsible at the National Archives to watch over this material?
So the National Archives, you know, they work with the agencies. The agencies are supposed to pass on any JFK records that they have in their, you know, in their possession. The Archives, you know, puts them out to the public. But, you know, the Archives is, it's a big government agency, budget of about $350, $400 million a year. But, you know, they're dealing with the CIA, a $15 billion a year agency. And so in that situation, the Archives is not in a position to dictate anything to the CIA. It's to the contrary. The CIA dictates to the National Archives. And so, you know, if they don't want to release something, even though the law calls for it, you know, the Archives isn't really in a position. They don't have the force to, you know, enforce the law. In the 1990s, when we had the JFK Review Board, you know, you had this independent agency that could go to the CIA or the FBI and say, you know, we want this document, we're going to make it public. You know, and the agency had to comply. There's no independent authority now, which is why the CIA feels that, you know, they have this sense of impunity. Congress passed a law and said, produce all the JFK records. You know, at the CIA, they say, you know, we don't feel like obeying that law, so, you know, we're not going to obey it. And Trump went along with them, and Biden went along with them. You know, that's the power that they have. Congress passes a law, they don't want to obey it, they don't obey it.
This is from Edison, New Jersey. Steve is next.
Good morning, gentlemen. I believe what this man is saying, Mr. Morley, is absolutely right. I wonder if he's come across the James File confession and David Atlee Phillips.
Yeah.
Has he noticed those two names?
Yeah. The caller referenced James Files is a man who was in prison. I think he got out recently in the last couple of years, who claimed that he was the assassin, that he was the one who shot the president. You know, Files doesn't have any independent corroboration of his story, and so it's a little hard to know what to make of it. He could have, based on what he said, I think he could have learned all of the things that he said from just reading the literature of the assassination. So I don't know, I don't disbelieve it, I don't believe it. I just think we don't know enough to whether we should credit that story. You referenced David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips was mentioned by James Files. He was a senior operations officer in the CIA. He's one of the senior officers who I mentioned before, who knew all about Oswald before the assassination. There's a big file on David Atlee Phillips that remains with many, many redactions, and we did not see any of that last week. So he's a person of interest. David Phillips is a person of interest to JFK researchers. He knew a lot about Oswald before the assassination. When he was called before investigations, he told a whole bunch of stories about Oswald, some of them quite contradictory. He couldn't keep his Oswald stories straight. So another reason why people are skeptical about the CIA's role in that. I mean, if it's so simple that Oswald up and shot the president, why would you tell so many different stories about him? You know, that's a good question about David Phillips. There's a lot of information that has not been made public about him.
Mr. Morley, have you or any other journalist that you know have tried to get information about the assassination through Freedom of Information Act?
Yes, we have. I spent 16 years in court with the CIA pursuing JFK records and obtained a bunch of material. I was looking for information about CIA propaganda operations involving Oswald. This is another one of the revelations that we've had since the 1990s. It turns out that the people who immediately sought to blame Kennedy's assassination on Cuba, on Fidel Castro were paid CIA agents working under a program called AMSPEL. That was the code name, AMSPEL. And we only learned in the last 15 or 20 years just how much AMSPEL was controlled by the CIA and run by the CIA. So the president is killed and CIA assets are immediately putting out the story, oh, Cuba's to blame, Cuba's to blame. Well, why did they do that? Who was behind that? My lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act was designed to get at that question. Who were the officers who knew about this operation? And we learned a fair amount about that. But the CIA stonewalled, and they were backed up by the courts, and so a lot of the story we never got. Why were CIA assets generating propaganda about Oswald both before and after the assassination? There's an 87-page document on the AMSPEL program that is heavily redacted. It was not released last week. So we have important information about CIA operations around the accused assassin that are still secret. This is the problem we face.
Jim in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hi.
Yeah, Jim, Pittsburgh. I just wanted to know if anybody has asked Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about the CIA, who incidentally spoke in Milan, Italy on November 16th.
Yeah, Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of RFK, has said that he believes his uncle, President Kennedy, was killed by a conspiracy from within his own government. So I don't know that he has talked about the CIA specifically, but he believes that his uncle was killed by enemies within the U.S. government. And he's said that, repeatedly over the years.
That was Jim. We'll hear next from David. David is, apologies for the, David from Missouri. David, good morning. Hi.
Morning, Pedro. And Mr. Morley, I would like to ask your opinion on a book that I'm sure you have read, and I'm not going to plug the book. But Tom Hartman from Free Speech TV and a cohort of his, while Hartman was a journalist, did a book on this, and it coincides with the organized crime in the CIA being at fault. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have read Tom Hartman's book. I don't agree with all of it, but I think that the picture that he paints, the situation in 1963 that Kennedy was in, the forces arrayed against him, I think his book is very good on that, on that particular, on the setting of the assassination and what happened, who Kennedy's enemies were at that time.
Mr. Morley, we have a viewer who asked, you've referenced him, but wanted to know more about what you know about Jack Ruby, or at least what you think is important to know about Jack Ruby at this state.
So Jack Ruby is the man who killed Lee Oswald, the supposed assassin of the president. Why did he kill Oswald? Ruby was asked this afterwards, and his lawyer told him, say that you did it to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial. And so that's what Ruby mouthed those words, and that became like, oh yes, he was trying to spare Jackie Kennedy. That is a totally preposterous claim. Jack Ruby ran a strip club. He was a pimp. He beat up people regularly in his club. His best friend was a dog. He had no feelings whatsoever for Jackie Kennedy. And he despised Bobby Kennedy because Bobby Kennedy's relentless efforts to prosecute organized crime figures. I interviewed a woman who knew Ruby well. She contacted me through my website, JFK Facts, and she had been a dancer in Jack Ruby's club, and they became friends. Ruby was very sweet on her and, asked her to marry her, and she was like, that's ridiculous, Jack, I'm not going to marry you. And so I asked her, so why did your friend Jack, why did he kill Oswald? And she said, I asked him that, and he didn't really answer. But she said, I'll tell you one thing. I don't think he had any choice. And I said, what do you mean? She said, everybody works for somebody, and Jack worked for people. And I think he had to kill Oswald. I don't think he had any choice. I said, who was it? She said, I don't know. She was 20 years old at the time. But she was convinced that Ruby did not have any choice about killing Oswald, that he had to do it. So Ruby was in jail in Dallas, and Chief Justice Warren came to visit him. And Ruby said, If you take me back to Washington, I'll tell you the whole story. This is to Chief Justice Earl Warren. Earl Warren didn't do that because Earl Warren didn't want to know. And so they never brought Ruby back to Washington to testify, to explain what he said was the whole story. And so Ruby stayed in jail, and he died of cancer 4 years after the assassination.
This is Patty in Connecticut. Hi, good morning.
Hi. Relating to that, Ruby was visited by Dorothy Kilgallen.
Yes.
And she got all the information from him, and she, of course, was bragging she's going to release it all. Of course, she died. She died untimely death, and they said she was on drugs.
Right.
And then allegedly, the rumors were that Lyndon Johnson was behind it because he was being brought before Congress on corruption the same day of the assassination. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's true that Lyndon Johnson was under investigation. His sidekick, a man named Bobby Baker, had been implicated in various corruption schemes, and Johnson was under investigation for that. And it's not clear whether Kennedy was going to keep Johnson on the ticket in 1964 or not. There was some speculation that he might replace him. I don't think Kennedy had made up his mind about that. I don't see any evidence that Johnson was involved in the assassination, but I think he knew instantly what had happened. And that's why, after Oswald was killed, Johnson and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover got together on November 25th, 2 days after the assassination, 3 days after the assassination, and they agreed they would investigate and that they would find that Oswald alone had killed the president. And Johnson and Hoover were very specific. We need to cut off speculation about Oswald's motives. We need to cut off speculation about his associations. Very quickly, people at the top of the government realized the most convenient truth was this one guy did it and nobody else is responsible, and we're not going to investigate anybody in the U.S. government involved in this. And so they decided what they wanted to find before the investigation had even begun. Before Kennedy had been buried, Johnson and Hoover decided they had the solution. One guy did it alone for no reason. The Warren Commission ratified that finding, but it was never particularly credible. It simply wasn't. You know, people say, oh, you know, conspiracy theorists. It was very simple, and this is a thing that's been ginned up by conspiracy theorists. No, that's simply not true, factually. Pollsters went out a week after the assassination, and they, you know, did a statistically valid poll, 1,000 people. What do you think happened in Dallas? Who was responsible and all that? In the two polls that were done that week, 60 to 70% of the people in Dallas and nationwide said more than one person was involved. At that time, there were no conspiracy theorists. Oliver Stone was in boarding school in Pennsylvania. And so it wasn't conspiracy theorists who came up with more than one person was involved. It was the circumstances of the crime that created that belief. It was not conspiracy theorists. It was the simple facts of the matter. And the government's explanation, this guy did it alone, you know, people never really believed it. They didn't believe it right after the assassination, and over time, that explanation has gotten less credible. And with all the information that we got in the 1990s, it has become even less credible. So the official theory is, you know, has failed. It doesn't explain what happened on November 22nd, 1963. So we still don't know.
One more call. This will be from
Sure.
Pete in Zanesville, Ohio.
Good morning, C-SPAN.
Morning.
You're on. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. The question I have for Mr. Morley is, does he put any credence in the theory that somehow the Secret Service accidentally, from the limo behind the president's car, accidentally shot him when the car accelerated?
Yeah, it's nonsense. It's a hoax. There's no evidence to support it. Photographic, eyewitness, forensic evidence. It's just one of those things that people make up. It's really unfortunate that story is still around. The guy who offered that theory, you know, retracted it under threat of legal, legal action. So no, it's nonsense.
To finish up, if you had full access to the documents available to you, where would you start?
I would start with those propaganda operations around Oswald before and after the assassination. That is the most suspicious thing that we have. Why was the CIA trying to blame the crime on Cuba right after Kennedy was killed? We still don't have a good explanation of who was behind that and what they were trying to achieve by that. That's where I would start. Jefferson
Morley is the author of several books, including The CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. His website is jfkfacts.org. Mr. Morley, thanks for your time. Happy holidays to you.
Thank you.
Coming up, we're going to talk about how other countries are responded to COVID, particularly in light of Omicron. Our guest is Medic's Global President and CEO Saigal Atzmon, and we'll talk to her about what she's seeing worldwide when Washington Journal continues.
C-SPAN is your unfiltered view of government. We're funded by these television companies and more, including Charter Communications.